Growing up in Haiti, I was the type of kid who would pay attention to everything in the surroundings, things like the name of the street, buildings, public places, and statues, among various others. And as you will probably guess, they are unfortunately most of the time named after a man. I will go and ask my dad about that person. He will give me a brief idea and be like, you know what? If you want to know more about that person, you will have to look it up. This is how I learned about many great heroes in my country. I looked up to them as I still do, and they have been very positive role models in my life. This may not be the case for some people, and might even be the other way around. As mentioned in the BBC Culture article, from the earliest inception, statues were as much conceptual as they were material, less about the individuals they depict than about how we see ourselves. Monuments and buildings and streets are named and made after people that we decide to commemorate for their efforts in putting another stone in the construction of the society that we strive for, as well as being a good depiction of the values that we share as a community, or at least I would hope so. The reason I say that is the fact on 2531 South and 400 East lies a beautiful building with its name written in big, Columbus Center. I saw it as a moral duty to let the representatives of that area know how I felt about the name and to request for a change. Nonetheless, there are still many buildings in the US, more specifically in the Salt Lake Valley, named after the Italian navigator. This made me realize that there is a huge misconception about this person here. This is the reason why throughout my speech, I'll be first sharing with you the legacy of Christopher Columbus that is still heavily impacting the world that we're living in. Secondly, why should you be concerned? Last but not least, if you decide not to willingly ignore his legacy and the image that he represents, what can you do about it? This navigational error that led him to land in the Americas on Christmas Eve of 1492 was the misfortune of millions here who were living peacefully on their lands, including the native inhabitants of the island where I come from, Hispaniola, the actual Republic of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. These natives were called the Taínos. They were the Arawak people that live in the Greater Antilles. The last one is the name for a group of islands in the Caribbean region. They called the land Haiti, until the man came along and named it La Española, meaning Little Spain, which later on became Hispaniola. According to the Smithsonian, Hispaniola became the first European colony in America. Although Columbus had formally taken possession of every island he found, the act was mere ritual until he reached Hispaniola. Here he began the European occupation of the New World, and here his European ideas and attitudes began the transformation of land and people. We are talking about colonization here. The island where I come from served as the cornerstone of colonization here in the Americas, a system both Haiti and the US fought against. Under his governance, the Taínos were spared from any sort of cruelty. A system called El Repartimiento was established around 1499 as defined by Merriam-Webster, a grant of forced labor as for use in agriculture and mining or in construction, imposed on indigenous inhabitants. I hope this is clear to everyone. Slavery, as we know it today, started in our region with the Repartimiento. Under the name of civilizations and Christianity, some of the most barbaric and unjust acts have been committed on the natives. They have been mercilessly massacred, raped, and have seen being taken away from them everything that makes them unique or simply human, such as their culture and religion. This brutal treatment led them to the brink of extinction by the mid-1600s, or about 150 years later, the arrival of the Spaniards. As a result, they began importing African slaves as another source of slave labor. To make matters worse, they came up with a system of racial stratification, which was later on used by the French colonists in Haiti. This division and constant terror were the key to the French staying in power on the island for about a century, though they had the smallest population among these classes. Most of you do not know what it's like to be living in a country in which the functions you could exercise, goods that you could own, and the determination of you being a property or not is based on the color of your skin. My ancestors have gone through all that and put an end to it with the price of their blood and even more. With the Haitian Revolution, Haiti became the only nation due to a successful slave revolt in 1804, the first independent nation in Latin America, and the second independent nation in the Western Hemisphere after the US. This fairy tale soon had to come to an end after independence, as they were so racially and socially divided. They started seeing themselves different from another. The only thing they could agree on was to get rid of the French, but not to build up a country. This same thing happened to many countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. Adding to that, there were years of isolation imposed on Haiti, as countries such as the US refused to recognize our independence since they considered us to be a bad influence for the slaves back then. Later on in 1825, in order to be recognized as an independent nation, from the conversation, France asked Haiti to pay a price of 150 million francs, or 10 times the amount the US has paid for the Louisiana territory. The sum was meant to compensate the French colonists for the lost revenues from slavery. This led Haiti to be in a devastating state by the time they ended up paying it. Again from the conversation, recognizing the gravity of this scandal, French economist Thomas Piketty acknowledged that France should repay at least 28 billion US dollars to Haiti in restitution. Finally, with foreign control and occupation, political instability, mismanagement of resources, corruption and unemployment, violence, and frequent natural disasters, it is no surprise that Haiti is now one of the poorest countries in the world. I want you to be aware that imperialism, colonialism, and slavery still have direct impact on people's lives till to this day. These problems cited were the reason why many people felt the need to leave Haiti, including myself. I want you to be infuriated by the stories of injustice and realize from the words of Watson Shire, no one leaves home unless home is the mouth of the shark. Unless you are a native, anyone here not only in the US but on this entire continent is an immigrant. Any means of oppression that causes you, our ancestors, to come here have been imposed on natives and black people by these tyrants. In a way, getting rid of all these symbols of intimidation is the least you can do to pay tribute to your ancestors. Ladies and gentlemen, all the Africans that were taken from their homes to become slaves here in the Americas, and the natives who have been wiped out from Hispaniola and elsewhere, lacked choice. Some inhuman conditions have been imposed on them, like bringing animals and plants that will change the fauna and the flora of the region, and even diseases simply weren't sufficient. But you, who is listening to me, does have a choice. You are lucky to be living in a country where there is a system with the intention to make it easy for ordinary citizens to reach out to their representatives. It is a right that shouldn't be taken for granted when so many people have been persecuted when their only deed was to live peacefully on their land without any form of repression. It is your duty to let them know that no longer we can have statues, buildings, and streets named after people like Christopher Columbus. He is an insult to immigrants, a divisive figure in our society, an oppressor who is responsible for the genocide of an entire group of people, led to the foundation of colonialism and the practices of slavery here in the Americas. Because not only he is not a positive influencer in our lives, and nor does making a statue of him depict how we see ourselves. And I promise that they will listen to you and act on it because they understand the power of one in our democracy.